Welcome back. This week's OECD report showed that tourism and immigration are the strong drivers behind our economic growth, which has averaged around 3% for the past 3 years. Both Labour and New Zealand First have vowed to cut the number of people moving here, saying the massive growth in migrants is putting too much pressure on infrastructure and housing as well. Immigration is also masking a few issues for our economy, not least growth in GDP per person, which is still low. National has made a few tweaks to the rules, but claims the economy can't cope with the drastic cut in the numbers.
Your tweaks take 30,000 out of it annually?
I wouldn't think so, no. They're not aimed at doing that, because a 30,000 reduction in migration right now will stall the economy. It'll deprive businesses of the skills they need to enable them to make the investments they want to make to grow New Zealand.
Well, joining me now is Max Rashbrooke, journalist and author and researcher. He's written a lot about inequality in New Zealand. Zoe Wallis, Chief Kiwibank Economist, and Dr. Oliver Hartwich, Executive Director of the think tank, the New Zealand Initiative. Welcome to you all. Zoe, if I could start with you, is that the case, that the economy is so weak if we took out 30,000 migrants we'd stall it?
Yeah, look, I think you've got to think about how the economy's been performing over the last few years, and that has been partly on the back of a really big net migration boom that we've seen happening in New Zealand. That is definitely one of the factors that's underlying supporting GDP growth. I wouldn't say that it would completely stall if you took out those migration numbers, but it would have an impact and would slow both capacity and demand in the economy.
Oliver, the immigration, the OECD said this week that we have to be patient, that the immigration will grow the economy, even though per person right now our growth doesn't look so good. Where's the evidence that longer term this migration boom is going to suddenly bring about a whole lot of growth and, I guess, bigger wage packets for New Zealanders?
Well, I think migration is already working for the New Zealand economy. We produced a report earlier this year where we actually demonstrated, for example, that the average migrant pays $2,600 more in taxes than they get in public services. And also, I think I agree with Zoe, the economy needs these migrants because we're lacking some skills in the economy, and that's something that the OECD also pointed out. So you talk to any of
working for the economy if per person we're going backwards. The last 6 months we've actually been in recession if you take it per person. How can that be good for someone on a low wage?
Well, it can be good because if you're actually talking to companies that are creating jobs, they say that they would like to create more jobs, but they're missing some of the skills in the market. So if we are able to bring in more people, we can actually grow some companies, we can grow the economy. That will be good for everybody, including people already here.
Max, you've written a lot about inequality. I mean, looking at New Zealand's performance over the last 7 years, and if we take a 10-year picture with the budget forecast, we're looking at 10 years of very solid economic growth. That's a great performance, isn't it?
Well, I think you have to question where the benefits of that growth are going. So if you go back, 10 years or so, the number of New Zealanders in poverty, 1 in 7 New Zealanders was living in poverty, on half of the average income. So people are really struggling. And that number is exactly the same today. For all this economic growth, we haven't made any progress on that. And at the most extreme end, you see the number of people rough sleeping in Auckland doubling, the number of people that the Downtown Community Ministry here in Wellington is having to help has also doubled. You have to ask, why hasn't it been a priority that we ensure that the fruits of this, reasonably strong economic growth has actually gone to those who need it most?
We are seeing that now, though, aren't we? We've seen a government that has increased benefit levels. We've seen a government that has also promising to distribute another $2 billion to lower-income New Zealanders. So they would argue they've got the books in shape, they've got the economy in shape, and now they're delivering.
I think that argument only makes sense if you think that governments can only ever do one thing at a time, and I think that's completely false. Governments are perfectly capable of, yes, going for growth where it's compatible with, environmental limits, but at the same time saying, well, how are we going to distribute it? And that's what this government hasn't put much attention to. Yes, they're now making some moves that are welcome, but, you look at even like last year's $25 a week increase for people on benefits. A lot of people on benefits are $200 below what they need, below the poverty line. There's a lot of damage to make up.
Zoe, there's a lot of talk about wages and this puzzle. Why wages, not just in New Zealand, but globally? What are the economists saying? Why are wages in New Zealand sluggish?
Yeah, I think if you think about wages, first of all, it's important to talk about real wages, not just headline wages. So if you actually adjust for the fact that inflation in New Zealand's been really quite low over the last few years, real wage growth has actually been a lot better than your headline numbers would suggest. That has turned around more recently with headline CPI rising and wage growth still remaining pretty sluggish. But look, I think wage growth in New Zealand is set to pick up, particularly as we start to see the labour market continue to tighten more and more. So you've got unemployment at 4.9% at the moment. That's probably going to head lower over the course of this year.
So what could we see in the next couple of years? You say, because we're looking at, you know, it's 1.5% at the moment, isn't it, wage growth? It's not much in the pay packet for someone on 50,000, but do you think it will get stronger?
Yes, our view is that you are going to see wage growth pick up, particularly as that labour market continues to tighten. So if you look at, for example, shortages in skilled workers at the moment, 40% of firms are actually saying it's really hard to find skilled employees. When you see a labour market that's that tight, typically what you do see is wage growth does start to build, and particularly now headline inflation is higher, it's easier for employees to argue for a pay rise.
But underlying this is productivity, that word, isn't it? And the underinvestment in new technology and new capital and new machinery that's going to enable us to grow faster, and that will really lift wages, won't it?
Well, yeah, and there's one other thing I think that really stood out in the OECD report. They pointed out that actually we have one of the worst track records for small OECD economies for foreign direct investment, inward foreign direct investment. So I think we have to really work on that.
Why do we need foreign direct investment? We've got money in New Zealand, we've got capital markets.
We are a small economy. Most small economies actually gain through foreign direct investment, not just the capital that they get, but actually the connections to other economies, the access to foreign markets, the access to different management techniques. So the OECD highlighted that we actually need to get more FDI into the country to enable to encourage.
But that's a hard sell, isn't it, Max? I mean, you're essentially saying we need to allow foreigners to buy more of our companies. Is that what Oliver's saying in your mind?
Oh, look, I mean, personally, I think a lot of the issues around foreign investment, to a large extent, are a diversion. You're talking earlier about wages. I mean, for me, one of the big stories is that in New Zealand, like, over the last period, last 10, 20, 30 years, productivity has increased massively. You know, people are working harder and smarter, but their wages haven't kept up with that. You know, if wages for the average person had increased in line with productivity, in line with economic growth, the average person would be earning probably $10,000 a year more than they are. And that's because, you know, a lot of that money, a lot of those company profits that used to go to people who rely on wages and salaries are now going to capital instead, to investors and banks and lenders and that sort of thing. So those big shifts, I think, play a much bigger part in inequality.
Let me bring Oliver in here. Your response to that, do you agree that it's just going into capital and then people are getting wealthier and wealthier on that capital?
No, I actually would want to highlight a different point here. The OECD also talks about housing, of course. When you're talking about economic performance, productivity performance, that's all important, of course, but there's a difference between how the economy performs and how it feels. And for a lot of people, I think the difference between economic performance and economic impressions is really the housing market. It doesn't really matter if your pay packages are going up 2 or 3 or 5% a year, if the housing market goes up 10 or 15. And I think that's one of the issues that the OECD highlights. We have actually lost some of the equality that New Zealand used to enjoy through the housing market. So if we really want to fix that, and if we want to fix how people feel about an economy that's overall performing quite well, we have to address the housing market.
Zoe, you're nodding your head there, the housing picture. We are seeing it come off, though, aren't we? In Auckland, we could see house prices actually fall.
Well, look, I think you are seeing price pressure and even sales actually decline in Auckland at the moment. Whether or not that's going to be long-lasting remains to be seen. I think if you look at the fundamental supply and demand of the New Zealand property market and consider how quickly we've grown in terms of population growth over the last few years, I don't think we've been investing enough to be prepared for that. Both in infrastructure and residential buildings.
Interest rates is the other part of that. It's hard to see interest rates going up in a hurry, so presumably that's going to keep some pressure on the housing market.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, low interest rates do encourage people to borrow to invest in their property market, and that's certainly what we've seen over the last few years. And when you think about it from an affordability point of view, actually, because interest rates are so low, a lot of people have bought houses because it's been quite affordable to meet your mortgage repayments. Whether or not that remains the case over the next sort of 10 or 20 years, that's the big question mark.
Inequality, Oliver, the argument is that inequality hasn't got worse under New Zealand, in New Zealand over the last 10 or so years. Is that good enough?
Well, it is not good enough because we have to do some things about the things that really matter when it comes to inequality, and that is the housing market. I completely agree with Zoe. We have pressures in the housing market. We have pressures because of the interest rate environment. We have pressure because of inward migration. We have pressure because the supply side is simply not flexible enough. I think if you really want to have an impact, you have to supply the market with the housing that this country needs, and that would actually be addressing some of the inequality concerns that people rightly hold.
Max, do you agree that the root of all this problem is housing?
No, I mean, I think Dr. Hartwich is right to highlight that as an issue, but it's certainly not the only issue. I mean, we saw a massive increase in inequality and poverty in New Zealand in the 1980s and 1990s. We have essentially done very little since then. I mean, it was falling a bit under the previous government. It's now increasing a little bit under this government. And yes, it's about housing, but it's also about what I talked about earlier, about people's wages not keeping up with the productivity they're putting in. The fact that our government now does much less to reduce, the OECD report said, our government doesn't do much to reduce inequality compared to other OECD countries. So there's a lot of things that are driving that inequality.
Oliver, what about this argument about our skill mix that, that it's not that we're not working hard enough, but we seem to be overqualified and sort of in the wrong jobs?
Yes.
This is what the OECD said this week. Do you buy that?
Yes, I think they actually highlighted something really important here. We have a skills mismatch. Some people are really well qualified, unfortunately, in the wrong fields.
Doing too many Bachelor of Arts degrees or something?
That's basically what the OECD tells us. So I think it is worth actually thinking about what skills do we really need. The OECD highlights mathematics as one of the core competencies that we need for jobs in the future, and I couldn't agree more with it. I also think we have to really think about putting more emphasis on knowledge in the curriculum and develop that, because, again, that will enable us to do the jobs in the future. And I think as far as the OECD highlights the skills mismatch, I think they're spot on.
And Zoe, they also talked about corporate taxes, these types of things. Do you think we've got the incentive right to grow the economy, to build from here?
Look, I think there's some question marks about what we do with those sort of policies going forward. One thing that is really the sort of big hurdle at the moment, it feels like, is what's going on in terms of residential construction and how we actually progress that. Because as we've already talked about, that seems to be one of the biggest issues.
And they raised some concerns here. They raised concerns that there is there's some pressure, or Stephen Joyce did, that the LVR restrictions, the crackdown on investment might be hurting our construction activity.
I mean, certainly when you look at
There's a balance, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the latest GDP data, for example, you can see that construction in New Zealand has actually pulled back over the first quarter of this year. And that's exactly the opposite of what you should be seeing. Admittedly, those numbers can be quite volatile, and we certainly do expect to see, given the huge sort of supply-demand imbalance we're talking about, that residential construction and commercial construction will
Is that partly the banks too, who have taken a slightly more prudent approach over the last 6 months?
Certainly, anecdotally, you're hearing the credit growth has been pulled back. Yeah.
Oliver, that must be a great concern, that at a time when we need lots more houses, the industry is going backwards a little bit.
Well, and the other concern is, of course, that we know how difficult it is to finance infrastructure that accommodates housing development. And again, the OECD had some interesting observations on that. They said that actually we should make it possible for local government to share in the proceeds of growth, in the proceeds of tax revenue when it comes to development, because they think we're leaving local government alone with financing the infrastructure that we need to make housing development happen, and all the upsides, all the GST, all the corporate taxes, the income taxes end up with central government. That is something that we at the initiative have said for a long time, and now the OECD has basically joined us for that.
OK, Max, I want to come back to you just on this issue of the skills mix and see what you think from, I guess, from a social researcher's perspective. Is there a problem in New Zealand that we've got too many people doing BAs, Bachelor of Arts, and these types of courses, and that we, as the OECD says, we need to be doing more maths, engineering, science, and that will make us richer?
I think it's certainly true that we do a very poor job of other kinds of education in New Zealand, particularly vocational education. We don't sort of regard that as a desirable thing to do, and I think there's a lot of research showing that if you're at high school and that's probably sort of the best thing for you to do, it's not very clear what the pathways are. It's not clear what you should be doing, what subjects you should be taking, how that transfers through into tertiary education. So I think we really need to copy the lead of other countries. Australia's done massive work on things like green skills and helping people, upskill to work on all those kinds of new areas, renewable energies, those kinds of things. I think we could take a lead from other countries and do a really big push on trade training, on skills, and I think that would make a huge difference.
Max Rashbrooke, thank you very much for your time. Oliver Hartwich from the New Zealand Initiative and Zoe Wallis from Kiwibank, thank you very much all for your time on Q&A this morning. Back to you, Greg.